seated in the third row, fingers interlaced. His gaze locked on her as though the very air between them had solidified. Caroline hadn't seen him yet, not just yet. Her smile remained, an effort to smooth over the tension, as if it were nothing more than a fleeting glitch in an otherwise seamless live transmission. Elizabeth offered no reply. Her eyes didn't lift to Caroline or the camera. They had wandered to the edge of the table. One fingertip tapped twice, then paused. The quiet wasn't loud, it was taut, chilled like polished stone, thick enough to contain something moments from breaking. The crowd wasn't angry, not yet. They hung in a strange limbo, suspended between the stage's gleam and a moment that had slipped the boundaries of the prepared script. Until that instant, Caroline held the reins. She commanded the room. She set the tone. Even the host had inclined slightly in her direction. But then something shifted gently, deliberately, as though a hidden truth had been stirred. And suddenly no one was quite certain whether to mask it or speak its name aloud. The camera refocused. A crew member raised a hand, but no one grasped the meaning, and Elizabeth remained silent. But in the third row, an older man in a charcoal suit, a pin with 3 stars across his chest, one dimmed, sat unmoving. No introduction, no mention on the guest list. Yet from that point on, each breath he drew began to reshape the weight of every word that had come before. The question shifted from had Caroline gone too far to did she even realize, who was sitting among them? You're watching a conversation take a turn no one anticipated. And the real question isn't about blame or triumph, but whether we can be still enough to catch what remains unsaid. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and what you think might unfold next. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss those moments that might just stop you and help you see things anew. It was an afternoon carved to precision. The talk show National Pulse aired live from Chicago, a full house of more than 200, bathed in stage lights, layered in laughter that arrived right on cue. Everything felt routine, and that was exactly why Caroline walked in, brimming with certainty. She stepped from backstage like a champion, crimson blazer, hairstyle to perfection, eyes sharp and a smile untouched by hesitation. She hadn't come to open up. She had come to take the floor. From her very first lines, Caroline set the beat. Her stories flowed with deliberate timing, laced with wit, and punctuated with pauses meant for laughter. When the host raised the issue of deepening rifts among the younger generation, Caroline simply shrugged. It's not that complicated. Some grow up with principles, others just grow up inside a system. Applause surged, nods of approval. Affirmation unchallenged. Elizabeth sat beside her in silence, watching. Dressed in black, her top high-collared. No adornments. She didn't object, didn't cut in, didn't even shift. The host turned. Elizabeth, what's your take on that statement? She replied, short and steady. That line wasn't meant for me. A subtle pause spread through the room. Caroline smirked, as though she'd claimed the first point. From the outset, the tide seemed to move in Caroline's favor. The cameras found her more often. The host appeared to echo her conservative leanings, and the crowd, whether out of alignment or curiosity, responded with more energy. Whenever she spoke, Caroline felt it. The wind was with her. She spoke faster, pushing further, slipping in barbed comments that barely left a mark unless you were truly listening. Sometimes I think people get invited on television not because they bring anything meaningful, but because they look like the narrative the media wants to sell. She didn't name anyone, but everyone understood. Elizabeth turned slightly, but still didn't speak. She laid her pen delicately on the glass table, as though bracing for something Caroline hadn't sensed yet. At that precise instant, for the very first time, the camera swept toward the audience and paused for less than a heartbeat. On the third row, no one caught it. Caroline didn't either. Another question surfaced, this time about the portrayal of women in politics. The host tossed it lightly, still chasing a laugh. Caroline, have you ever felt misjudged simply for being a woman? She didn't flinch. Oh, certainly. But what rattles people more is when I refuse to apologize for standing firm in my beliefs. Applause again. A young woman nodded in the audience. A man tapped something quickly into his phone, and somewhere, a subtle pause had begun, not out of disapproval, but because something no longer sat quite right. Caroline's confidence grew a touch colder. Her gaze was no longer fixed solely on the host. Now and then it flicked toward Elizabeth, as if confirming that silence still held. Elizabeth said nothing, but her eyes had moved, past the lights, past the cameras, and fixed on someone particular. No one noticed the man in the third row. There was no spotlight on him, no placard with his name. He was simply present. Inside that studio, every element had its place. The dominant voice, the quiet one. The laughter, the script. Everything followed plan. Until Caroline spoke one more line, a sentence she thought would vanish. And she laughed, sure of her command, never realizing that beneath her, a man had just raised his eyes. And from that moment on, the story was no longer hers to tell. The host veered the conversation gently, shifting toward a familiar fault line, representation. In modern governance, Caroline, he said, how do you respond to those who say they no longer feel seen within today's system? Caroline leaned forward, fingers interwoven, her voice soft but unwavering. I believe everyone has the right to feel overlooked, she said. But sometimes I wonder, are they truly being left behind? Or have the roads been laid before them, and they've convinced themselves it still isn't enough? A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd, not because it was amusing, but because some in the room felt quietly affirmed. Elizabeth furrowed her brow. Her gaze dropped to the table, but her silence remained unbroken. Caroline pressed on. There are people who enter public life, not from principle, but because they fit a moment, a campaign, an image the media finds useful, not because they're capable, but because they check a box. And then came the line, delivered lightly, almost flippantly. Because they're the right color. It didn't land like an accusation now, more like a stray observation, dropped into the space, as though harmless. She laughed gently, tossing it off with a breezy, I mean, I'm just joking. A weak, singular chuckle escaped someone near the back. The host blinked. A pause hung in his throat. He smiled tightly, unsure, and turned toward Elizabeth. Elizabeth, would you care to respond? Elizabeth turned to Caroline. She looked at her, really looked, but didn't speak at once. Then slowly she turned to face the audience, and the camera lowered. Not by chance this time. And everyone, for the first time, truly saw him. The older man in the third row. His gaze never left Caroline. He sat upright, not leaning back, his palms resting on his knees. No flinch, no fury, just presence. A silence sharp enough to draw blood. Caroline began to feel it. A tremor too subtle to name. She let out a short, awkward laugh. Half a joke, half armor. I know I can be direct sometimes, but maybe Americans need to toughen up a little. This time, no reaction. No nervous laughter. No polite smile. Just stillness. Elizabeth's eyes didn't move from the third row. Not the host. Not Caroline. Him. And in that moment, she looked at him, as though asking silently, what do I say now? The camera returned to the host, whose face betrayed disorientation. There was no playbook for this kind of silence. No teleprompted line to bridge a moment when the crowd no longer knew where they stood. Caroline exhaled just lightly. She could feel the shift, not because someone challenged her, but because no one did. And that was what changed everything. Then Elizabeth spoke, but not to Caroline. My father, she said, is sitting in this room today. The room turned, almost as one, toward the third row. He remained motionless. No nod, no acknowledgement. Caroline turned too. Her eyes met his. No one could say how long the moment lasted. 3 seconds? 10? But to Caroline, it felt like falling without ground. And for the first time that evening, she said nothing. The host did not step in, whether out of understanding or bewilderment. He said nothing. Elizabeth placed her hand gently on the table, not to gesture, but to steady herself. I grew up in a home, she said, where my father was asked, almost daily, where are you from? And when he answered, I was born here, they followed with, no, but where are you really from? No interruptions, no applause, no underscore, just her voice, even and certain. And today, when a woman stands on this stage and jokes that I'm here because I look the part in front of him, maybe you think it's just a joke, but to us, it's a wound that never fully closed. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She looked forward, her words settling like stones in a still pond. Caroline leaned slightly forward, as if to speak, but the lens no longer held her. By then, the audience wasn't consuming content. They were witnessing something else entirely. Not an argument, not a performance, but a stillness, a reckoning. A question had begun to stir. If I've ever laughed because it was just a joke, was I part of the hand that kept the wound open? Something had shifted. Not through raised voices, not through confrontation, but because the camera didn't move. It remained on the man. Caroline was only just beginning to truly see. He sat unmoved. No expression of blame. No plea. But his gaze said everything. And with that look, every excuse fell quietly apart. It was just a joke. People are too sensitive. I wasn't talking about anyone specific. They didn't need to be refuted. They dissolved on their own. Caroline's hand gripped the armrest. Ever so slightly. She had debated elected officials, faced aggressive interviews, withstood picket lines, But now, she didn't know where to place her eyes. She looked to the host. He was reading something. Or maybe just avoiding her gaze. The air had changed. Not heavier, just quieter. So quiet. Even the soft click of Elizabeth's pen against the glass rang out like a knock on a long-shut door. Then, without signal, he stood. No screech of chair. No drama. Just one hand pressing to a knee. A slow lean forward. And he rose. Still. Calm. Deliberate. The atmosphere felt drained. As if the air itself had been drawn out. Caroline leaned back, subtly. Not from fear, but because she no longer knew what response fit. He didn't move toward the stage. He didn't exit. He simply stood, hands resting at his sides, eyes unwavering, locked on Caroline. Not in condemnation, not in judgment, but with a gaze that asked to be met. Fully. Honestly. And in that gaze, there was no room left for retreat. There were no accusations. None were needed. Because his silence, his very presence, spoke louder than anything uttered on that stage. A few audience members shifted uneasily, glancing sideways, seeking silent affirmation that they too felt the weight of what was no longer just unsaid, but unmistakably present. An assistant leaned toward the host, whispering perhaps about timing, perhaps about moving forward, but no one moved, and the camera held its frame. His face, each crease, every silver strand, wasn't severe. It simply was, like a mirror, and in its reflection, those who looked saw not him, but themselves. Caroline's gaze turned toward Elizabeth. For the first time all evening, they were no longer cast as adversaries, not lines drawn across debate. Now they were simply two daughters, seated before a father. In that fragile instant, Caroline thought of her own, not to compare, but to remember. He once told her, speak what's true even when it's hard. But he'd never taught her how to speak truth, without first knowing who was listening. And now another father, quiet standing, was teaching her that lesson, with more clarity than any panel or platform ever had. The host cleared his throat, grasping for the thread of the program. We'll now move on to the next portion of our hour. But his voice faltered. No objection followed, but no one truly listened either, because the image of the man, standing in the third row, had become the gravity around which everything now orbited. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't condemned. He hadn't asked for anything. And yet, everyone in the room felt something inside themselves begin to stir, to shift, to examine. Elizabeth placed her hand gently over her heart, just for a breath, then lowered it, and turned to Caroline. Her eyes weren't angry. They didn't forgive. They simply searched, as if asking, can you see me now? Caroline offered the faintest nod. So slight, no one noticed, except her. And then, quietly, deliberately, the man in the third row sat down. No applause, no release, only the soft dimming of lights, as though even they understood that this moment belonged to no one. It belonged to truth. And truth doesn't require celebration. It only asks to be recognized. When her father returned to his seat, something in the air settled alongside him. No one called for silence, but no one dared break it. Caroline leaned slightly back in her chair. Her words stilled. The host turned the page, resuming the next segment, or at least attempting to, but the momentum had departed. The room's energy no longer obeyed the script. And then Elizabeth spoke. I used to think I understood my father, she said, until one day I found out he was once called the educated houseboy. While serving abroad in uniform, not a sound in the room. The cameras adjusted quietly. Without direction. No cue. No transition. He never told me. I overheard my mother bring it up. Over dinner. I asked him, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" She paused, the words stretching wide. And he said, "Because I didn't want you to carry bitterness. I wanted you to carry light." A breath slipped from somewhere in the audience. Someone lowered their gaze, not out of sadness, but because a memory they hadn't known they shared had just been spoken aloud. Elizabeth waited, not in hesitation, but to give the room a moment to catch up. "I used to think my father was too gentle, too quick to forgive, but when I was 16, I watched him testify at a land hearing. He was the only black person in the room, and he didn't flinch. He didn't soften. I asked, 'Weren't you afraid?' And he smiled. 'No,' he said. 'I'm not afraid of their silence. I'm afraid of mine.'" In that instant, Elizabeth ceased to be a politician. She wasn't persuading. She wasn't defending. She was remembering. And in that memory, she held up a mirror and placed it, gently, before them all. Caroline shifted in her seat. Her expression was unguarded, unhardened, as though for the first time, she was seeing beyond herself. Elizabeth continued, "When I stepped into politics, my father didn't celebrate. He just said, 'You won't be undone by cruelty. You'll be undone by the quiet things.'" The things said, as if no one's listening. Then she turned to the camera. "But today, someone said it was just a joke. But remember, every joke has an audience. And sometimes, that audience is the one who never speaks." A tremor moved through the crowd. Not a murmur, not applause, but people adjusting in their seats, as if something unspoken had finally been named. And something unusual occurred. No one apologized to Elizabeth. No one leapt to defend Caroline. But something subtle and true, tilted toward Elizabeth. Not in claps, not in cheers, but in understanding. For the first time, the host looked up and away from the teleprompter. "I think," he said, "sometimes the most meaningful things we say don't come from any question." Elizabeth didn't respond. She simply inclined her head. Not in victory, but as if to share the memory, equally, with every soul in the room. Even Caroline. And at that moment, Caroline lowered her head, not out of shame, but perhaps in recognition that there were stories she had never asked to hear. Elizabeth's father sat unmoving, and for the first time, he smiled, not broadly, not through tears, but enough to show that he had heard, and that he had seen what needed to be seen. In that moment, it was no longer a talk show. It became something else entirely. A more honest version of the country it tried to reflect. One person had spoken without thinking. One had remained silent until silence mattered most. And one had told a past so that others might never forget. Why are we still here, ChatGPT? James Bangi Akwet Touch Makong. There was no prompt to stand. No exit music to signal an end. The host offered his closing thanks, with a voice softer than any he had used before. As if the room itself had asked him to whisper. Everyone left the set not as performers, but as people. Changed, still carrying what could not be put into words. Later, the footage was aired. It didn't explode. No sharp headlines. No spliced reels with captions in bold. Just one continuous conversation, where nobody won. No chairs were pulled. No microphones cut. 12 hours passed. A student in Minneapolis, journalism major, barely 20, shared the full video on an anonymous account, with a caption as simple as breath. Not because she demanded tears, but because she spoke hurt, and didn't beg for sympathy. Not long after, a father in Kentucky posted the same clip. White, middle-aged, Republican. "I used to laugh at just kidding," he wrote. "Now I'm telling my son. Only say that if you've looked around first." It didn't go viral. It traveled, thread to thread, quietly, like an underground current, on forums and group chats. The moment when Caroline joked, when she turned unknowing, was given a name. The second the unseen became visible, someone else wrote, "He stood," and we stopped looking at her the same. The networks held back. No primetime specials, but on one midnight broadcast, the segment was aired. A full minute, no words, no commentary, just the still frame of the man rising. Then sitting at a high school in Des Moines, a government teacher played it, without introduction. Afterward, students were handed a slip of paper with one question. What does it take to shift the air in a room without a single word? Answers ranged from because he was someone's father, to because he didn't need to correct her. She heard herself. A Cambodian student wrote, because he wasn't asked to explain anything. And then Caroline disappeared. Not in disgrace, not in denial. She just stepped back. No talk show bookings, no sound bites. Her staff gave one short line. Caroline is taking time with family and reflecting. There was no campaign to reshape her image. No claims of being misunderstood. She didn't erase what she'd said. She let it remain, unadorned. Some called it silence. Others whispered, that may already be growth. Elizabeth posted no statement. But 3 days later, an image surfaced. Her father seated alone in a narrow hallway. Beneath soft lights, hands resting quietly in his lap. No phone, no team, no posture, just stillness. Her caption read, he didn't need agreement, only recognition. The photo never trended, but it was printed and framed above a chalkboard in a small school in Philadelphia. The principal, once told she was too passive to lead, scribbled beneath the frame, sometimes authority is what remains after silence. In a country church outside Mobile, a pastor invoked the same image during Sunday's message. Wisdom doesn't always come from speaking truth. Sometimes it comes from knowing when not to speak at all. And still, across city halls and classroom boards, a phrase took root. Someone stood. Nothing more. Everyone knew what it meant. Caroline resurfaced eventually. On a podcast mid-interview, someone asked, do you have any regrets this year? She paused. 3 seconds. No breath, no excuse. Then, I wish I'd known there was a father in the room, and that not everything has to be said, just because you're the first one to say it. No applause, just a long quiet, and no one clicked away. At a youth conference in Oregon, a teenager stood on stage and said, I don't want to grow up to win arguments. I want to grow up to know when to stop talking, because someone in the room has probably heard that joke before, and this time, they need someone who chooses not to tell it again. Asterisk. Elizabeth was never declared the victor. No titles were handed out. No hashtag campaigns launched. Only a shift, a tilt, toward her. No cheering. No verdict. Just stillness, like the sound of a room, relearning how to listen. A candid photo caught her later, alone in the hallway, folder in hand. She was looking down, not with shame, but as if considering what it meant to have finally been heard. The student photographer, freshman, newly minted journalist, wrote in the caption, I used to think strength meant being right. Last night I saw someone, strong enough to be changed. No editorials followed, no speeches replayed, but in quiet corners, law school lounges, teachers' break rooms, poetry forums, a phrase surfaced, the sentence that was left unsaid. And slowly, the jokes that once ended with just kidding stopped coming, not because anyone banned them, but because they stopped fitting. In an indie bookstore in Charleston, the shopkeeper taped a photograph to the back wall. The man, standing, silent. When asked why that image, she replied, because I want people to stop speaking for just one breath before they say something they can't take back. And somewhere else, on a brighter set, with a louder host, another guest started to wind up the same tired line about sensitivity, about skin, about laughter. But this time, mid-sentence, he paused. And then, he chose not to finish it. He simply moved on. But then, the host paused. No script, no calculation. He simply stepped in gently. Forgive me, he said, but I think we've learned something tonight. Some things no longer belong in the part of the show meant for laughter. The guest fell quiet, not embarrassed, just still. And the room shifted, not from outrage, but from the simple act of someone choosing not to let it slide. Not this time. As for Elizabeth, she didn't retell the story on morning programs or press panels. She didn't post a clip, didn't offer commentary. She went back to the quiet work she'd always done, but something subtle had changed. After every hearing, she began a new habit. She would close her notebook deliberately, then raise her eyes and hold the gaze of every person in the room for 3 full seconds. Before leaving, she never explained. She didn't need to. Those who were there understood. She was leaving space for others, to hear their own words, echoing back at them. In a confidential memo, circulated inside an education nonprofit, someone wrote, "Progress doesn't always come as protest. Sometimes it's the moment someone chooses not to reply." By the second week, Caroline's comments faded from memory. No one repeated the line, but everyone remembered the man who had stood and the woman who had said nothing until silence mattered. A 12-year-old boy in El Paso, son of a farmhand, wrote to Elizabeth's office, "You didn't yell, but I knew you were mad. And I was too. Thanks for not yelling. I think that's how you protect yourself. And stay proud at the same time." Just when it seemed the moment might dissolve into stillness, another video surfaced. A quiet, behind-the-scenes clip. Before the broadcast. No makeup. No podiums. Elizabeth, seated beside her father, asks gently, "If I don't say anything tonight, will that disappoint you?" He takes her hand, smiles. "You don't need to say anything. Those who are listening for real will hear it anyway." One conversation, one sentence, one man who stood, and one woman who never needed to win to make everyone think differently. Where are you tuning in from? What part of this story made you pause? Leave a thought in the comments below. And if you believe in the kind of presence that doesn't need volume to carry weight, subscribe. There are more stories like this, not the ones that go viral, but the ones that stay.